Welcome to The Landscape, your show about America's parks and public lands. I'm Aaron Weiss with the Center for Western Priorities in Denver.
And I'm Kate Gretzinger in Salt Lake City. Today on the podcast, we're talking about water, stream access in Colorado to be specific. We've got a conversation for you about some activists working to change the state's very prohibitive wading laws, which make it illegal to touch the beds of rivers, even when the water running through them is technically public. They made a short film about the subject. Sterling is filling in for me today since he was able to catch the film screening live. Stay tuned for that, but first, the news.
Public land hater-in-chief Mike Lee is once again taking a shot at our national parks and public lands. Senator Lee just released a proposed amendment to the Interior Department Appropriations Bill that is making its way through Congress right now. That amendment would pave the way for Doug Burgum, the Interior Secretary, and President Trump to give away or sell off national park units. So, bear with me, gonna explain this. As it's written right now, the Approps bill would prevent the Interior Department from disposing of national park units. That's a provision that was introduced in response to Secretary Burgum's suggestion that the Park Service doesn't need many of its smaller sites like national historical parks, national historic sites, national recreation areas. And this may seem pretty out there, like, why in the world would they do that? But the threat is real. You'll recall that President Trump and Secretary Burgum's proposed fiscal year 2026 budget only contained funding for a fraction of the national park system. If that had passed, it could have led to the elimination of more than 300 national park units, according to the National Parks Conservation Association, which did the math on a cut of that size. So the Approps bill, as it's written right now, would protect those park units from disposal. Senator Lee's proposed change would remove that protection. This is essentially Senator Lee once again sticking his foot in his mouth by trying to make it easier to sell off public lands. And the question now is what becomes of this amendment. Congress is facing down a January 30th deadline to fund the government, and shenanigans like this are the kind of thing that could lead to another shutdown. I was just talking to a reporter from the Deseret News pointing out this is the kind of stuff that makes Mike Lee honestly not terribly popular with his own colleagues in the Republican Party, because they very much do not want another shutdown, particularly in an election year. So Mike Lee running around with these antics of adding land sell-off in the middle of what is supposed to be, hey, let's get this done, is really not appreciated by anyone in the Senate right now. Our guests today are Cody Perry. He's a filmmaker based in Colorado who founded Rig to Flip, a production company that shares stories about the outdoors and the West. And we've got law professor Mark Squillace from the University of Colorado Law School. He teaches public lands and environmental law, and he is featured in Cody's new documentary short, which is called Common Waters. It is about the public's access, or lack thereof, to streams and waterways in the state of Colorado. Before we get into details of the film and everything, Professor, I want to start with you. Can you explain how the management of public waters is different from the management of public lands in Colorado?
I think probably the best way to start is to think about waterways in two different categories. We have navigable waterways and non-navigable waterways, and the rules are different depending on which category you're in. Now, the problem is that there's no clear delineation of which rivers in any state are navigable or not navigable. The test for navigability is based on an old Supreme Court decision called the Daniel Ball, and it basically says that you have to show that the waterway was used or was susceptible to being used in its ordinary condition as a highway for commerce at the time of statehood, using the kinds of craft that could have been used at statehood. So you can imagine this is a kind of a difficult evidentiary test that has to be met, because you have to go back and look at the conditions of the river and the kinds of craft that could have been used when the state became a state. In our case, that's 1876. And so it's a little bit tricky. So that's for navigable waterways. And the reason that's important is because on navigable waterways, essentially the state was given title to the bed of all of those rivers when it became a state. In Colorado's case, that was 1876. And it happens automatically, although again, we don't know which rivers might meet that test. And so it's kind of a tricky sort of issue and question for it to be resolved. Importantly here, the U.S. Supreme Court has made clear that that title that the state receives to the bed of navigable rivers is not a title like it holds in land, public or otherwise. It's a title that's held in trust for the people. And what the Supreme Court said was that it's title held in trust so that the people can carry on commerce, have the ability to navigate, and also have liberty of fishing therein, freed from obstruction by private parties. And so on navigable waterways, there's a very powerful test that basically says the public has rights there. And essentially, the states can't take those away. Now, with non-navigable waterways, it's a little bit trickier because that is based on state law. And all 50 states have their own kind of rules about what the public's rights are with respect to non-navigable waterways. Some states, including some of our neighboring states, have pretty broad rules that essentially apply the same test for non-navigable waterways. That is, they allow the public to access all non-navigable waterways. And by the way, when we're talking about access, we're talking about both floating and standing on the bed. So again, if the state owns the bed of the river, if you're standing there, you're standing on state property, that shouldn't be a problem. But a number of states, most recently, New Mexico joined this group, but they basically say the rules are the same. You can stand on the bed of a non-navigable stream as well as a navigable stream because the public essentially has an easement. Even though the land under the non-navigable stream is privately owned, the public still enjoys an easement over that land because it's the nature of water, and we treat water that way. So that's the key problem that we confront here, is that if you're dealing with navigable waters, it's a different test from non-navigable waterways.
So it sounds like Colorado's different than a lot of other states. And so why is it that the state of Colorado hasn't yet clarified what stream access means in our state?
Yeah, I mean, I find it totally baffling that Colorado is different from other states in this regard. I mean,
well, especially given we're such a recreation economy, right? Like we have so many outdoorsmen.
This great recreation economy. I don't remember what the figures are. It's something over $60 billion, I think, of our economy is based on public recreation opportunities. Outdoor recreation in particular, of course, is a big deal. And yet Colorado is one of the worst states in the country, maybe the worst state in the country when it comes to stream access rights. And it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I suppose one could say that one of the reasons for this is just this long history of denying public rights in waterways. And so once you have sort of a kind of law, or at least a policy that denies the public access for over many, many years, people get used to that kind of position and they don't think it's appropriate to change it. But, part of the problem comes from this old Supreme Court decision that this is the Colorado Supreme Court now. It's a case called People versus Emmert, in which the Supreme Court of Colorado said that on a non-navigable river, the public has no right to even float through the waterway. So if you are floating through private property, you are essentially trespassing over that private property. And so that is inconsistent with the law in virtually every other state in the country. I mean, really hardly anyone would deny the right of the public to float through private property. And part of the reason for that is that the water itself in virtually every state is deemed to be the property of the state. And so if you're floating on the water, you're basically floating on public property. And so it doesn't make any sense to say the public has no rights there. But that's exactly what Colorado said. And it bears noting, and this is really important, our Colorado Constitution says that the waters of every natural stream in the state of Colorado are hereby declared to be the property of the public and are dedicated to the use of the people. And so it's really shocking that the court would basically deny the public the right to even float when the framers of the Constitution back in 1876 said that these waterways were dedicated to our public use.
So, all right, so we have this case here where clearly there is some inconsistency between what the Constitution said and what the law has effectively been or how it's been enforced. Cody, I want to bring you in here. How does all of this land on your plate? And you're like, there's a movie to be made. There's a story to tell here.
Well, yeah, I might start off by saying, I actually see rivers and public lands as being like inseparable. I see them as being directly linked. And where I kind of see this being like this really important story goes down to how like the strength of the law and its responsiveness and adaptability needs to change over time. And, so the necessities and the desires of the public have changed radically since the late 19th century, like when we became a state, and then subsequently over all these different court rulings that kind of Mark, talked about. The indulgence in our recreational activities has reached such proportions that it's considered to be an essential element of our lifestyle. And, for me, like where I come from and my company, Rig to Flip, it's a boating term and my roots are in boating and like all of my origins of like actually finding and expanding the world around me came from pursuing stories that in a sense were very rooted by following rivers. And so I knew that there was a story here and there was like all these, like particular issues that rooted up on the Taylor River in 2010, in the first right to float issue. So, where I really, really got into this are all those things, but definitely from this like emerging aspect that I see of the privatization of public lands and public spaces emerging in a different context than what we saw with like Mike Lee and the One Big Beautiful Bill. It also has other faces. And this is one of those faces here where we're inheriting Colorado's lack of addressing these issues, but we're also seeing these like societal trends that in some ways shape how public spaces become privatized.
Yeah. I think it's safe to say that this film really stems from a love for Colorado lands and waterways, right? I had the pleasure of viewing the film up at the CU Boulder campus. I chatted with Mark for a little bit there. One of the things I found the most interesting about the film was, Mark, you make an honest attempt to get arrested for trespassing while accessing these waterways. Why?
Well, it's so frustrating. The film in many ways is about this Roger Hill case that I served as the lawyer for Roger Hill. He was fishing on the Arkansas River. We claim that the Arkansas River is navigable under this navigable for title standard. And if we were right, then presumably the state owns the bed and they own it in trust for the people. And Roger would have a right to fish from the bed. And, we basically were denied the right to pursue that claim by the Colorado Supreme Court. We spent 5 years in litigation through the federal courts and the state courts, only to be told finally that we had no right to be in court whatsoever. And that's even after Roger Hill had been stoned by the local landowner and had been threatened in writing with arrest. And under general law, you don't need to be a good lawyer to recognize that people who are suffering that kind of injury should have the right to have their day in court. And the Colorado Supreme Court denied Roger that right. And so that's an important part of, I think, the story. And so as a result of that decision, the only way that we can really get to where we need to be in the courts is to have somebody get arrested. Because if someone is arrested when trying to fish from the bed of a stream, we then can use it as a defense. So we went into court as plaintiffs, arguing that the Arkansas River is navigable for title. And as such, we had to show we had what's called standing to be in court. But if we were to go in as a defendant because we were arrested or somebody was arrested trying to fish, then we could make whatever defense we wanted and the court would have to hear that defense. And so somewhat ironically, it seems like the only way we can get the courts to hear our substantive claim is to get arrested. Very frustrating. I mentioned, I think at the event that we had in Boulder, I mentioned that this kind of started, or it kind of got started because of an editorial that I wrote way back in 2010, basically acknowledging that I was a criminal trespasser because I had floated through private property in violation of the Colorado Supreme Court's decision in the Emmert case. And that kind of triggered, ironically, that really, I think, is what led Roger Hill to find me. And the rest is kind of history, as they say.
All right. So there's this chicken and egg problem. It does sound in many ways like the corner crossing case out of Wyoming that did finally make it to the Supreme Court, of course, and the Supreme Court passed. So at least in the 10th Circuit, on the federal level, corner crossing is the law of the land, but you needed that test case of someone who got arrested and then there was a civil lawsuit. Any thought then of trying to do something similar? I mean, how far do you go to try to get arrested? Can you find a friendly, unfriendly sheriff who'd be like, hey, would you mind coming to arrest me? Can you find a landowner who like otherwise wouldn't mind you floating through their property, but would play along for the sake of getting this case going?
It's a really interesting question. We went back to the river and sort of basically tested whether or not the landowner would call a sheriff and have us arrested. And it was pretty clear to me that they've been talking and that they recognize that they don't want us to be arrested because then we do get our day in court. And I think they're afraid of pushing this issue too far because I think they know they're going to lose on the merit.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want that test case to come forward. So I suppose we kind of joke about the fact that maybe someone should go out and get arrested. Maybe it would happen someday. And if it did, maybe we'd have the case and we could get the court to hear the issue. But at this point, it doesn't seem to me like we're likely to succeed in getting somebody arrested, at least not in the short term. You never know how these things go. We'll continue to probably joke about it. And I don't necessarily want anyone to get arrested. I've talked with my students about this who have threatened to go out and see if they can get arrested. And I've warned them, no, they don't want to do that. They have to still get into the bar.
I was going to say, aspiring lawyers are not the ones to go get
they're
arrested.
They're not good candidates for being arrested. That would be, particularly as their law professor, I don't want to encourage them to get arrested. So, it's an interesting kind of question, but it's just very frustrating because I think quite clearly the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong in denying Roger Hill his day in court. And again, lawyers can debate this issue, but I've talked to a number of them, and I think almost everyone I've spoken with agrees that the court was wrong in reaching the decision it did. There's another interesting aspect of this case in terms of the legal side of it, which is that our case never would have been thrown out, but for the fact that the Attorney General tried to block our standing in court. And so one of the issues that we're trying to pursue right now is to engage with the candidates for Attorney General. The current Attorney General is term limited. He's not running again. He's running for governor instead, which is kind of an interesting twist. But the candidates for Attorney General are people who could turn this around on their own. They could bring the case and basically claim the public's right to use our navigable waterways. They could bring a case to determine which of those waterways are in fact navigable. And so one of the strategies that we're looking at is trying to persuade the candidates for Attorney General that they should switch sides essentially on this issue and support the rights of the public to use our state waterways.
I kind of love that was second to the getting arrested strategy. Like you tried the first one and then went to the lobbying side of things.
You never know.
You never know. Cody, I'll pose this question to you. So I got to see the film. It was great. How can people view the film?
So right now what we're doing is we're taking the film across the state to do, events and educational outreach, a basically tour where we're coming to your city. We just finished one in Grand Junction and in Denver. We're getting ready to do another in Telluride and Durango and Steamboat and Salida. And we're going to be doing these showings throughout going into next summer. This film's going to be released on NRS's platform, which is the presenting sponsor. So you'll be able to view it for free here in the coming months. So, the best way to see it is to find a showing, look at coloradostreamaccess.org, our website, where we have the events being posted there online, or follow our Instagram handles there, Colorado Stream Access Coalition, where we also post these event opportunities that'll be, again, all across the state. And we'll try and do multiple showings in similar areas, multiple on the Front Range, all across the Western Slope, and so on.
You're pretty plugged into the outdoor recreation industry here in Colorado. What are the practical implications of this legal limbo that we have here in terms of stream access. Of everyone's pretty sure the current situation wouldn't hold up in court, but no one's able to get there and prove it. What does that mean to the guide companies? What does that mean to the rafting companies? What does that mean to the folks who just want to get out and cast a line and do some fly fishing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's part of the big reason why we're doing this in the first place, is that this does have like the potential to reach out and impact like everyday Coloradans who are out there just, trying to get away from it all. Like, we all need that. We all use the like outdoor and public spaces for us to like go out and reset, reconnect, go out and just like have experiences with our friends and family. And that can be disrupted. Roger Hill is out there like trying, he has a strategy to get standing in court, and, they're like put in a position where, that's what they're having to contend with. But, that's not something that like everyone, necessarily has a choice in, like whether they do or not. They can find themselves in this situation, whether they're floating down the Blue River and have like a confrontation with a landowner in that space, or really like any river. There's 150 named rivers in Colorado. Every single one of them, have like commercial, rafting use and like private public use on the rivers. Of those 150 rivers that start and end at points of public access, float through private property. So virtually every river in the state is touched by this issue of potentially being in a space where landowners that can afford these properties, which, like isn't all of us. In fact, it's very few of us. And if they decide to make this an issue where they can pursue civil trespassing charges against people merely floating through their property, and certainly through wading through their property, the Emmert court decision left that in a place where we're all exposed. We're all exposed to being like essentially barred from these rivers, as Mark like quite pointed out in the film. Like if you're charged in with civil trespassing and found, liable in court, if you're to go back, you're going to be found in contempt of court, and then you're going to jail. And so like we're essentially barred from that river if that's in that particular scenario.
Yeah. Can I build on that a little bit?
Please.
So I think the state of confusion over this issue is deliberate. I think folks know that if we were to try to clarify the law, it's probably going to be in favor of more public access. And we don't know what that looks like right now, but I do think that that's why we're seeing pushback. And a lot of that pushback is coming from these rich landowners that Cody was talking about. This is something that I find remarkable. These rich landowners essentially act like they own portions of our rivers. And I don't believe that you can own a river. I'm sorry. I don't think that that is something that people get to own. People might own the bed under a river. But again, I think that bed under the river is probably subject to a public easement. It should be subject to a public easement because these waterways of ours are so important, as Cody was talking about, to our spiritual needs. People need access to waterways. That's part of, I think, what makes us feel whole about our connection with outdoor life and outdoor recreation. And so it's really important. There's this great quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes from a number of years ago, the famous Supreme Court jurist, who said, "A river is more than an amenity. It is a treasure." And I reflect on that partly because Holmes was this very conservative property rights oriented judge. And yet even Holmes recognized the importance of public rights in our waterways. And for whatever reason, we here in Colorado, we have not been able to get past that problem here. And I'm hoping that with Cody's movie and all the great work that he's done and some of the great work that other folks are doing, that maybe we can get there.
Yeah. And if I can also piggyback on that too, like Mark said earlier, this clause out of the Constitution that the water of every natural stream in the state of Colorado is hereby declared to be the property of the public. And I don't think that those who like wrote the Constitution said a single word more than they meant to say there. They weren't, like some like high and mighty like group of people that intended this like these waterways to be for the select few that can afford to be by them, I think they meant exactly what it says, that the rivers and streams and waterways are meant for the people. End of story.
Professor, if you'll indulge me, I want to go off topic for a second because you are here with us and because there is so much else going on public lands. You have been an attorney at the Interior Department, and obviously we could spend a whole episode talking about everything that's happening there. But I want to kind of sum this up with one question, which is to look at all of these rules that the Interior Department is trying to, and Agriculture Department, are attempting to roll back right now. The public lands rule on BLM land, the roadless rule across national forests. We saw some attacks on the Endangered Species Act last week. All of this is coming very, very, very fast. We're only 10 months in. What does the speed of that mean in terms of the chances that any of this holds up in court? Are they, in your opinion, going too fast? And will that eventually mean that all of these attempted rollbacks don't hold up? I mean, is this a repeat of what we saw during Trump 1, or is there a chance they succeed this time?
It's a really good question. And unfortunately, I think that some of these rules, because they were based on policy choices that the agencies were making, can be reversed by a different administration that has a different policy perspective on these issues. And so that's particularly true because of the current Supreme Court that we have, which seems inclined to allow the Trump administration to do much of what it wants to do. I think the public lands rule is an interesting case study for this issue. I mean, there are a couple of aspects to that particular rule, but one of them is that it basically allows the government to designate certain parts of our public lands for conservation purposes. That should not be controversial. You know, we have long espoused the idea that our public land should be managed for multiple uses. And the developers want to say that those multiple uses should only be for extractive kinds of uses, mining and oil and gas development and those kinds of things. But clearly multiple uses encompass recreational uses as well. That's clear from the multiple use laws that we have. And so it's somewhat ironic that we would try to throw out a rule that simply recognizes something that I think is inherent in the law.
Mark, if I remember correctly, you've been advocating for river access in Colorado for a long time. How long would you say? How many years?
Well, I first became aware of this issue when I was teaching in Wyoming, which was I started teaching in Wyoming in 1984. So I'm dating myself here. But I became interested in it, and I always thought it was odd that Colorado had such narrow rules. Even Wyoming has much better rules for public access than Colorado. Didn't make any sense to me, but I kind of didn't focus on it too much until I came here to teach in 2005. And then some of my students spurred me on to sort of focus on this a little bit more. I had a student who wrote a paper about public access more broadly and raised these concerns about Colorado law. I teach the water resources law course here, and so I'm constantly bringing it up with our students and talking with them about this issue. We had a little group that was formed about 10 or 15 years ago here at the law school looking at that issue. The problem with students is they graduate. And so, you know, you have them here for 3 years and they get interested in an issue and then they're off doing other kinds of things. And so it can be a little bit frustrating to keep continuity with some of these kinds of programs. But on and off, I've been focused on this issue for quite a long time. I wrote that editorial. I think I've written another editorial on the stream access issue. Another one could be coming down the road here. So I'm trying to keep public focus on this issue as much as I can. And I think that's part of what Cody's film and what we're trying to do right now. We think that there needs to be public education. If you talk to our state legislators, I sense this kind of fear that they have that if they were to support broad public access rights, that somehow that would be the end of their political careers. I frankly don't understand that. I mean, I would think that most people in this state would be wildly in support of politicians who support broad public access. I can't cite you surveys or support for that, but if you were to look at the surveys on public lands, it goes to close to 80% of the public supports broad protections for our public lands. I'm hard pressed to think that it would be different with respect to our public waterways. And so I think that public education, which is a lot of what Cody's film helps us to do, could be a big help in convincing our politicians that it's okay to support broad public access. And I have to admit that they're up against a lot of money and a lot of powerful people. These landowners have claimed that they own stretches of the river. They have these fishing clubs where they want to keep the public out. And it's problematic. They do have a lot of power, I think, with the legislature, and they're well organized. And so that helps them, I think, to push back against these broader initiatives. But I happen to think that if we keep pushing on this issue, if we keep educating people and explaining that we are really an outlier among our neighboring states, that maybe that will be enough to persuade our legislators that it's time for Colorado to join the rest of the country in providing broad public access rights.
Yeah. And what I just find it really inspiring. I mean, you said 1984 was when you became aware of these issues.
Yeah,
that's
right.
that's 31 years ago. That's 31. That's at
It
least
just
30
shows
years.
my age, Cyril.
Right.
Yeah.
But I mean, you've been at it for a while. So, Mark, we'll start with you, and then we'll finish off with Cody. What's keeping you motivated to continue this advocacy?
Well, a lot of times this fight has been sort of lonely. As I said, I have students who are interested in it, and we start talking about it and they get excited and then they kind of move on. And what really keeps me motivated right now is this coalition that we've formed that has some people who are really dedicated to seeing this issue through. We've had some hiccups here and there. Some folks who are supporting floating only, are pushing their ideas, and that, from my perspective, isn't really an adequate solution to the problem. And so, we've had to deal with those kinds of issues. But I just think that the coalition and the folks who are involved in the coalition are really dedicated to getting this thing done and making sure that Colorado joins the rest of the country in providing broad public access rights. And so as long as my colleagues in this coalition continue to work, I'll continue to work too. I think we're going to win this fight. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't know when it's going to happen. I don't think it's something we can rush. I think education is part of this, and education sometimes takes time, and we will have to give it that time that it needs. But we're going to keep moving on it, and I think eventually we're going to prevail.
Love it. Cody?
I've been so lucky to, have the privilege to pursue like outdoor recreational activities. And for me, those activities have always served as a vehicle to better understanding. And, I credit my parents a lot for kind of posturing me in a direction to look upon the open lands of the West and and understand that, there's meaning and purpose to be found out there, not just adventure and greater understanding and all of those things. It's about the journey. So, I love a good underdog story and a good underdog fight. And in this particular case, I see this this issue being one of where your average public land users and really affectionists, people who love open spaces, are put up against the juggernaut of private interests and quite wealthy. As Mark said, that the power structure is deeply ingrained and rooted into our elected representatives. They have their ear, they have their checkbook, and I have no illusions that this is something that we'll be able to win overnight. So I'm constantly reaffirmed by the landscape that I travel through and the people that I get to talk to. And I find our common rootings and our common waters, as the film says, in those spaces, in the commons. So that keeps me going, is having direct and constant contact with the places that shape our identity and give us this purpose. And finally, this just really sits so well with me, is it's about the common good. And, it isn't just about rafting or fishing. It's just down to the basic necessity that rivers are something that every living thing like gravitates toward, where like, you know, the spark of life really like is situated next to. And you don't have to like own a $10,000 raft or a $700 fly rod to like benefit from the basic recognition that would be enshrined in law that the public has access to these spaces and should forever. So, you know, this is a moving subject that like I will never like get off a sense of purpose and feeling driven to move forward with other members of community who see that same value in fighting for what's right for everybody, not just the well-off and those with the means to like purchase their own private domain. This isn't about that. And I'll always be like pushing for the better in this case.
Filmmaker Cody Perry, law professor Mark Squillace. The film is called Common Waters. The website is coloradostreamaccess.org. We've got a link to that in the show notes. Thanks to both of you for joining the pod today.
Thanks for covering
Thanks,
it, y'all.
Aaron. Thanks, Sterling. Good to see you, folks.
Well, that will do it for us today, folks. We will drop a link to Cody's film in the show notes. It's a pretty quick watch, so be sure to check it out. We will also drop in some links where you can follow the fight for stream access as it unfolds next year. We've already recorded an interview with Bobby Scopa of the group Grassroots Wildland Firefighters Network. We're going to drop that in the feed the week after Christmas, so be sure to check back and listen to that. Bobby has done this for more than 40 years, has some really fascinating perspectives on the state of wildfires, wildfire prevention, prescribed burns, you name it. This is a really great interview that I did along with my colleague Lauren Bogart, so look for that in your feed in a week or so.
That's right. And thank you to Professor Mark Squillace and Cody Perry, as well as Sterling, who stepped in to fill in for me today. And as always, thank you for listening to The Landscape.